Howdy y'all, it's Presley. Today on the Live a Little podcast, I spoke with Eli Sussman, who is the editing manager of FishStripes. He controls the social media for Pitcher List, which both are baseball outlets. It's the first time I have done any baseball content on this channel. It was a good time hearing him analyze the Marlins prospects that will be coming up pretty soon and previewing the 2020 Marlins season. Really smart dude. Go check out his writings over at FishStripes. It's SB Nation for the Marlins. I will link all of his social medias in the description. I hope you guys enjoy. Peace. All right, so I'm here with Eli, and I know what you do, but I'm sure there's going to be a couple of people watching this. So would you like to explain what your job is?
Well, thank you for inviting me on, Presley. I'm Eli Sussman, managing editor of FishStripes. I also manage social media for Pitcher List, both of those being baseball outlets. Pitcher List is all about fantasy baseball and deeper analysis. FishStripes focuses on the Miami Marlins, all things about the Marlins. The site has been up since like 2005, but I've only been there the past about 3.5 years or so, and I've been running it for about 2 years now, covering everything about the Marlins and across all forms of media on our website, fishstripes.com. I'm pretty big on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at FishStripes, the YouTube channel, the podcast that we have, and I think we covered the organization differently than anybody else does. It's a lot of fun.
I mean, do you consider yourself a Marlins fan? Anyway,
a little bit. I guess I grew up. That's my dog right here. I grew up as a Yankees fan in New York. When I moved down to Miami for college at the University of Miami, that's when I got physically closer to the team. I'd say when the new ballpark opened in 2012, and while I was in college down there, that's probably when I'd say the fanship with that team started up, just because of the proximity to the team. And that happened to be a year in 2012 where obviously the team made a lot of high-profile changes, and almost all of them blew up in their face, but it was really interesting to cover. And the ballpark it all just really fascinated me. And of course, making a lot of friends down there that grew up as Marlins fans, it gave me a much stronger connection to the whole history of the organization and all that. And I actually joined FishStripes probably in like 2016. And so I'd say it wasn't my original team growing up as a baseball fan, but I've been able to pick up a lot of the nuances and a lot of particular challenges. And of course, all the highlights that have come before I was a fan back in 97 and in 03. And then even those teams like in the late 2000s that had a lot of fun and had so much high ceiling talent. It's been an interesting education into the whole team. And then I like to think I've arrived at a point where now I can be an authority, especially on what they've been doing the past few years under new ownership, paying as close attention as I have those years. I like to think that we're now a pretty valuable resource to all fans.
I mean, I can agree to that. I've gone through and just been scrolling through Twitter, and I see y'all release an article. If I'm not doing anything, I'll go through and read it. And I'd say y'all are a pretty big source for my news because I don't live anywhere near Miami.
Right.
So
we come to find that Marlins fans are spread out a lot more than I'd originally expect, even outside the U.S., even on the other side of the world. But also, of course, in Miami in particular. And because of some of the changes that they made to the organization under new ownership, they've done a slightly better job at engaging the ones actually in the surrounding community, too.
Yeah, I remember when they released the park days, the weekend park days where they did different events on certain days. I think that was last summer. And I thought that would be a big deal when it came to bringing fans in, but you have to be winning too. That's another big part in it.
Yeah, it's a very big test right now because a lot of the team's big financial decisions are coming up, and they're reaching a point where there's nowhere to go but up at the major league level. And it's a difficult balance between investing in the team to make it really attractive, and also, of course, actually getting those people to physically support the team. with financially by going to games and by buying merch and just by holding conversations about it in their daily lives. And yeah, ultimately it's just going to take some winning to really spark that. And that's what they're hoping to do starting this year.
Are you excited about any of the players that they brought on?
Yeah. I'd say the one that I was the guy that I had a different perception of originally, Jonathan VR, when they acquired him from the Orioles. I thought he was a little overrated. I thought what he did last year was kind of unsustainable. Like, he was in anonymity over there in Baltimore as like their only good player. But when I dug in deeper, he has a really interesting skill set. Last year, one of the most valuable base runners in baseball. And aside from hitting for good power, and aside from the raw base stealing totals, he does a lot of little things that like add a lot of value. And then it came as a surprise that he was actually earning less money this coming year than originally projected. He's an $8 million player who is going to be heading into his walk year and really motivated. So it's a difficult balancing act in this situation, because even if the team is improved, you'd expect that some guys like him, who are a pending free agent, if he does do as well as everybody's expecting, he would be a very obvious trade candidate as we get to the middle of the year. But maybe there's a right situation where he performs so well that they hold on to him through the whole year and then extend a qualifying offer to him and see how that plays out. But he's one guy that, because of what he does offensively and because of his versatility defensively, you plug him into the team and he doesn't really disrupt anything that was already going on. He just makes it better. And that's a simple thing that they didn't really get a great handle of, especially last year, signing guys that just clearly made the major league team better. They brought in really respected veteran players. I'm trying to think of one example. As I'm coming on with you right now, the Marlins put up a new podcast episode with John Birdie. John Birdie had that fun rookie year last year, and I'm kind of excited to see what he does this year in like a super utility role behind VR on the depth chart. But he went out of his way to mention how Martin Prado and Curtis Granderson and Neil Walker were so valuable to him in the clubhouse. But it's it's hard to respectfully just acknowledge that those guys were really terrible on the field last year.
Well, yeah. And age hurts.
Yeah, and the Marlins paid some actual guaranteed dollars to bring them in because of what they'd accomplished in their careers. And then this year, they're just going in a slightly different direction, going slightly younger, guys that are a little bit closer to their primes, and that there's actually a scenario where they can be really valuable and be like strong veteran presences. So I'm hoping that they threaded that needle the right way. And overall, I've been pretty satisfied with how they've tried to serve all those purposes.
I remember a specific example of watching VR play. It was the day after Fernandez died. I went to a Rangers game, and they were playing the Brewers.
Right.
And that might have been his rookie season, but the game I went to, he popped 2 home runs, and I thought he was going to, I didn't know that a year later he would be with the Orioles doing basically nothing, but at that time, watching him play that day, he looked like $1 million. Well, in your instance, $8 million. Right. He looked like that $8 million.
Yeah, he's a really curious guy. He's following him on Instagram this offseason. He's very outspoken about things going on. I think he's Dominican, right? But he's at least staying most of his offseason in the Dominican Republic, and with their winter league going on, he had some really outspoken comments that I couldn't totally follow the conversation because it was in slang and in Spanish. But he's a really energetic guy. I'll just say it that way. He's opinionated, but I think a lot of his teammates really like him, and he has that chemistry with Jesus Aguilar, another guy that the Marlins claimed off of waivers. And Aguilar is not coming off the same single season that VR did, but just 2 years ago, he put up those really great power numbers. I think that I like how that worked out. Both of them were acquired on the same day, actually. So I don't know if that was some of that was just the timing of the baseball calendar that both of those guys were available at that moment. But I like how the Marlins seemingly took that into consideration when they were acquiring them. The fact that they'd been teammates with the Brewers for a couple of years, including 1 year in 2018 when the team was really great, And I think that stuff matters, is just having some continuity, because overall the team is bringing back the majority of the players that were here last year. It's just sort of an addition by subtraction to unload some of the veterans that were struggling. And then for all the other roles that they really needed to fill, they've done what I think a pretty good job across the board in just making sure that the team is better, and doing it in such a way that I think these pieces complement each other pretty well, so that there's some potential for them even to overachieve just the basic talent level just because of the way that they fit together.
The guy who really like stuck out to me was Corey Dickerson.
Right.
Because the one thing that I've noticed throughout my time as a fan is there hadn't ever really been a power left-handed bat in the lineup. Like, you had Yelich, but he wasn't what he is now. And you had D. Gordon, and he was never power hitting anything. And that's really the only... I've been a fan since 13, so that's really the only two left-handed hitters I can really even think of. Like,
well, you can't forget about Justin Bohr. Justin Bohr was there.
Oh yeah, you're right. I did forget about him.
Yeah, but he got off to the gates pretty slow in 2018, and I don't know if you were familiar with this or your followers are, but he's in Japan for this coming season with
Yeah, I saw something about that.
Yeah, the name escapes me, but he got a decent money to go over to Japan just for 1 year, and he's a guy that I could see spending multiple years there if he wants to, because this is the type of player that goes over there and tends to be really popular, and if he could just focus on the hitting side of it, can do pretty well. Since then, though, I mean, Dickerson, and I mean, you could argue that Dickerson is even a better player than Bohr ever was at his best. The thing holding Dickerson back is some of the injuries he had last year. A couple of them were fluky injuries I'm not too concerned about. And yeah, he's a really thoughtful player, really cerebral player with both his hitting, but also his approach to defense too, because I think most people got excited about the fact that he won a Gold Glove a couple of years ago, and he really explained that pretty much in detail about because this is a guy that just the year before he won the Gold Glove, he was DHing a lot with the Rays. Like, they didn't even think he was one of their three best defensive outfielders, and he made an all-star team mostly for just being a DH, and then the next year he goes on and performs really well in left field. And he's not like an exceptional athlete, but he really makes the most out of his body. The workouts that he does are really specific in terms of actually applying to the baseball field that I was impressed by. And I mean, just as a hitter, he's been really great overall almost every year of his career. And the one thing that was held against him early on is his platoon splits. And it didn't look like he could hit against lefties. His team didn't really even trust him putting him in the lineup against lefties. And that has started to turn around the last 3 years or so, where he's still obviously at his best when he has the advantage against right-handers, but he's capable of being in the lineup every day. And if not hitting for power from both sides against both types of pitchers, he at least sees a lot of pitches and works deep counts. And the Marlins desperately needed something like that.
Do you see him in left field or center field, or where do you see him playing for the Marlins?
A lot of left field. I mean, he played center field a little bit earlier in his career. He may end up making some appearances there just because of all the question marks that team has in center field aside from him. I mean, the other candidates being Brinson and McNair Sierra and Monte Harrison as a guy you could call up pretty early in the year. I mean, all those guys would be better defensively in center than Dickerson, I think, just because of their athleticism and because of their recent experience in center, whereas Dickerson's like a few years removed from that. I mean, the one questionable tool for him defensively is his throwing arm, and it helps that in Marlins Park they brought in the fences both in dead center field and in right center field. So, I mean, that's an interesting thought about how all of a sudden you can put somebody in center in that stadium, and it's not such a liability if they have issues throwing, because it's just not as deep in the first place. He's not going to have to make crazy throws. They're not quite as far as they used to be under the old dimensions. So, now that I think about it a little bit more, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he sees some appearances in center, but primarily he's going to be in left.
Do you think Harrison will be called up this year? Because haven't really heard anything about that situation.
I'm I'm basically certain that he will play in the majors this year. It all depends on the timing of it. He's at a point where 24 years old and turns 25 during the summer, and he's been playing professional baseball since high school. He's on the 40-man roster already, and he was on the 40-man roster last year. He would have been up probably by the end of last year if he didn't get hurt. He hurt his wrist at the start of last season, and then he aggravated it in the middle. He had a minor surgery done on the wrist, and that kept him out a couple months. But he returned at the end of the regular season, and then he played in winter ball, and now he's been involved in those the hitters camp that they had. So he's fully healthy at this point. It's not a question of health anymore. There's some really mixed evaluations on what he's going to ultimately be in the majors because he has such a high ceiling with all his tools, but some evaluators are just so skeptical of him actually being able to make contact with major league pitching and put balls in play. But they're going to give him pretty sizable opportunity because that's really been the overriding philosophy of the rebuild is getting a lot of guys that have high risk but very high reward and just giving them a chance to show it. Obviously, Lewis Brinson came over in the same trade, the same Yelich trade, and they gave him such a long leash. It's not going to be quite the same. They're not going to stick Harrison out there for a full year, and if he's like struggling to that extent, but Harrison's even a better overall athlete than Brinson is, and even though there is some of the same type of risk, they just really love his tools and his intangibles. So to me, it's just a question of how early, and I would be shocked if it takes any longer than half the season because he was at AAA when he was healthy last year. And for a guy that is a little bit older for prospect standpoint, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to like manipulate his service time and worry about that because it's set up in such a way that he's already under club control throughout his entire 20s. And I mean, that's a good problem to have if he reaches the end of those club control years and he enters free agency as a valuable part of your team. But they don't need to worry about that all that much with what we know about aging curves right now. Like a lot of the best players in the majors right now are younger than Harrison is, like Juan Soto and Acuna. He's like even Cody Bellinger is only about a year and a half apart from him. So he doesn't need any more time, in my opinion. It's just about having the opportunity, and the way it shapes up right now, they just don't have very many superior options in center field, and just because of that, I think he's going to make it up pretty early in the year.
For progression reasons, do you think that Blade could get the call up this year?
That would be surprising. I mean, considering that how recently he was drafted, the track record is there. I mean, the comparisons that probably the player that he's most similar to in terms of other recent draft picks is someone like Michael Conforto and having that same type of skill set at that position and the same looking swing. And Conforto, just like him, was a super early first-round draft pick with the Mets, and he ended up making it up like at the end of his first full pro season, the same late season call up that Blade would be in that same timeline. His performance in Jupiter last year was kind of uneven. It was really limited sample size, and it got a lot better as the year went on. So I think the biggest question is whether he's even going to begin next year in Jupiter or in Jacksonville. It could go either way, just because of the performance was kind of uneven. He's going to be at Major League Spring Training. So I think that's the most important thing is for him. I mean, sometimes we focus on the major league guys at spring training and who puts up the better numbers, but year in and year out, like that stuff proves to be nonsense. And the numbers they put up in those games don't really translate much to the regular season one way or the other. So for me, I'm going to be fixated on guys like Blade during spring training, even though I know he's not going to be on the opening day roster, not trying to win a job. But I'm just curious to see his approach in spring games, facing better pitchers than he's ever faced before. And trying to get a gauge for like his all-around game, because I mean, the most important part of your skill set as a position player is offensively and being able to get on base and hit for power, and he has that potential. But I'm really curious to see defensively as well, because we just touched on the big question mark that the team has in center field. And I think the assumption with Bleday is that he's not going to be a guy that plays center. He's probably going to shift over to right. He played a lot of right field in college at Vanderbilt. But I mean, sometimes players surprise in that way. So I'll be looking closely at what he does even defensively in spring training games, because if he has that versatility, then he makes a much stronger case for him to get called up. I mean, the main thing working against him is the rule change, whereas previous years, the last several decades in baseball, rosters expanded to 40 guys in September, and that's not going to be in effect anymore. Now they limit it to 28 in September. It's going to be expanding by a couple of spots at the end of the year, but not nearly as much as before, which means he's going to have to move past some of these other outfielders in the organization that are really hyped right now, whether it's Monte Harrison or Jesus Sanchez. And I mean, not that long ago, we were really excited about Victor Mesa. Mesa is going to be starting out at a higher level this year than Bleday is. So he's going to have to leapfrog over some guys, or there will have to be injuries, something like that. My best guess is that it's definitely in 2021 that we see him, probably early in the year, but not too early, maybe May or June of 2021.
So you think we'll be talking about him like we were talking about Harrison just now? Like that kind of path?
Well, it's a different sort of conversation just because, again, Harrison has been playing pro ball for like 6 years now, whereas Bleday is on that much faster track. And he came into the reason why teams angle for such high draft picks, why you can understand some of the tanking motivations, is that Bleday is such a polished all-around player, whereas someone like Monte Harrison was just the opposite of that. He was so talented as a multi-sport athlete that the Brewers originally, and now the Marlins, taking a chance on him developing all the other nuances of the game to understand it. But Bleday is kind of the opposite, where he's just so refined. He's and for what it's worth, he was a national champion in Vanderbilt this past year. He was right in the middle of that team. And just watching him last year, even though the results were kind of mixed, the approach was really sophisticated. So, I mean, that's the reason why he may be able to burst through to the majors much quicker than anybody would expect. But overall, just with the team in 2020, in all likelihood, not going to be able to contend, that they're not going to force him up unless the performance is really so extraordinary that they can't help it anymore. They need to be looking out for their long-term interests with him.
Do you have anybody specific you're going to keep your eyes on this year, major league level, like progression-wise?
Oh yeah, probably the top of the list is Pablo Lopez, where I have a bold prediction out that I think Pablo could be the most valuable player on the team this year, which I guess would catch a lot of people by surprise, although they probably weren't expecting Sandy to be like one of the most valuable players on the team last year. With Pablo, I just love almost everything about him as a player, and both the intangibles and the pitch mix that he has. I'm going to actually put together a video probably within the next week, just breaking down his whole pitch arsenal and how he uses the fastball, the breaking ball, and the changeup, and how they all have potential to be above average pitches, the way that he uses it together. He's only going to be 24 years old this year. He's younger than Sandy. He's like the same age as Jordan Yamamoto, much younger than Caleb. Like he has so much of his career still ahead of him, and he's had those shoulder issues now a few times. And way back in the day, he had Tommy John surgery as a prospect. But in terms of his performance, like when he is fully healthy and locked in, I think he could take a really big leap this year with how he uses his pitches. It was so confusing last year, where he had a couple outings where he got absolutely destroyed, and those kind of skewed his overall stats. And frankly, I was kind of disappointed in exactly how he looked late in the year once he finally came back from the most recent shoulder injury. But fully healthy, just remembering even what he looked like coming into spring training last year, where he seemed to be a really good breakout prospect, breakout pick, or major league player, and it didn't exactly unfold the way it looked like. But I think he's a guy that just can really consistently hit his spots, and even with 3 pitches instead of like a larger arsenal. He's someone that mixes his pitches well enough and has enough diversity in those pitches to get a lot of swings and misses when he's on. So he's a lot of ingredients that, as long as he stays healthy, I could easily see him being the best pitcher in their rotation. Not a superstar. Like, I should be clear, it's not the same type of high risk, high reward player. He's not like a typical Marlins player in this rebuild with that super high ceiling, but he could have a really long career in this league as a starter, and I think he has a lot to prove this year.
So you think he's going to end up like a 2 or 3 or 4 guy?
Yeah. I think best case scenario will probably be a 2 in an average rotation. If the Marlins expect to be a juggernaut, like a dynasty, then he's probably more of a number 3 pitcher on a type of stacked pitching staff. But that's really important to have. And those guys, you can see get paid really well these days in the majors, and they're really important. And the Marlins, for a bunch of this past decade, it's been so hard for them to even find that kind of player. They thought Wei Chen would be that type of player. He didn't age that well. But I guess that's not a perfect comparison, because I think Pablo has even higher upside than Chen did before he came over to the Marlins. But it's not all that easy to develop. You can't really take it for granted to have steady starters in the middle of your rotation, but he could definitely be one of them.
So are you more of a interest in pitching or position players when it comes to development?
No, I'm equally interested in both of them. I think last year I pretty much split time following a lot of them. I watched a lot of more Marlins minor league baseball last year than ever before, and I think people can understand why, because the farm system finally got great at a lot of different positions. A guy that I watched plenty of down the stretch was Lewin Diaz, and I'm paying attention to a lot of subtle things in his game. He's a prospect that probably more so than anybody else I'm going to be fixated on this year, because from what I saw late in the regular season with Jacksonville, and then in the Dominican Winter League they played after the year, there's a lot to like when you just study the way that his body language responds to different types of pitches, and how he's seeing pitches really distinctly, and how that contributes to him not swinging and missing all that much. Looking at him defensively, because that was such a big surprise. This was a guy that at this time a year ago was like a nobody in the Minnesota Twins system, and another reason why he took a big leap forward on prospect rankings is because he showed he could be a really good defensive first baseman. Like, it's hard to get excited about first base prospects, because if you don't work out there defensively, there's nowhere else to go, right? It's the bottom of the defensive spectrum. You usually don't find another position that you're effective at if you struggle at first base. And so with him, he had to lose a lot of weight to get into much better shape. And I've liked seeing him on Instagram recently, showing all of his workouts. He's still in his best shape of his life compared to where he was when he was a Twins prospect. And that really shows up when you watch him defensively, how he stretches for balls at first base, and the type of throws that he makes across the diamond when necessary. He's really smooth at that. And so I can't think of the last time that the Marlins had a first baseman in their system that was like that. That was a plus defender at first base. So, I mean, all that is on top of the obvious stuff that he's a great power hitter. He had 27 home runs last year in the regular season. A lot of that at Double-A when he was facing a higher level of competition than he ever faced before. So, yeah, I mean, I study like everything in these guys' game. Jazz Chisholm being another guy that the Marlins traded for in the middle of last year, and he played with Lewin at Double-A towards the end of the regular season. And I mean, what jumps out to you when you watch Chisholm is how hard he hits the ball. And we're now able, we now have the data to actually quantify that in the minor leagues as well. In the majors, they use StatCast. In the minors, at least through the end of last year, they use TrackMan, and now they're going to switch over to another data provider. But we know that his average exit velocity, 92 miles per hour, which even by major league standards is pretty elite. And you can just see it when you watch him play, the way he's able to send it to all fields, and the way that defenders kind of react to it, and they look so confused. Like they're confused when they see the ball come off the bat, and it gets to them a lot quicker than it's supposed to. and that contributes to a lot of misplays or a lot of extra bases for him. So, I mean, those are just, I could go on with all the little things that I try to notice when I watch these guys develop.
What specific example of what has impressed you the most over the Jeter era?
Oof. Well, I guess this is pretty generic, but just the way that he implements a lot of fan-provided feedback into running the organization. In terms of, I guess the most obvious example is the rebranding of the team logo and the uniforms and the ballpark itself, redesigning that. All those things taking a pretty significant financial investment in order to do that, having the colors somewhat driven by market research. I guess I don't want to be too corny about that and give him too much credit for doing the new color scheme. It's because some of it with the team and with Jeter in particular is just trying to divorce themselves from the old ownership, changing things for the sake of change in some cases, just so that people don't associate his Marlins with the old Marlins. And a couple of those changes have been unpopular. I guess the most unpopular one probably was on the TV broadcast side, when they pushed for the change in removal of Rich Waltz, and then briefly Tommy Hutton was pushed out the door as well on the TV broadcasts. And there wasn't really any way to justify that other than they wanted, again, that just a totally new image in all these aspects of the organization. But for the most part, they're shooting a really high percentage with what they've done in terms of the changes that they've made. Just trying to bring a more authentic Miami feel. And it seems it's a little weird to think about it that way, considering that both Jeter and Bruce Sherman, who has the largest stake in the team, I mean, those guys are from New York, or at least they spend most of their time in New York. So they themselves are not authentically Miami, but they've moved over a lot of these marketing and just everybody else that they've kind of deferred to people within the organization that do have a better feel for what the fans actually want and will respond to, and the team that they actually feel really connected with. And I mean, the lowest point in that relationship between the Marlins and their fans was, I guess, right around the construction of the new stadium, one that the public ended up paying for, and paying for with a lot of interest attached to it as well, and putting it in a location in South Florida that's not really accessible in the way that it should be for a big major league team. And those are a lot of the challenges that they still face with, like, making the team really accessible to as many people as possible, making it like affordable and efficient for people to attend games. So they'll never be able to totally fix that as long as the stadium is exactly where it is. But just on everything else that they've been able to control, with the things that they've been able to actually control for themselves, the image of the team and, the values that the team stands for, those have been like very much needed changes that actually make the team more attractive to fans and then also to players, whether you're a free agent or even a prospect. They've made it much cooler to actually be a Marlin than it used to be.
Well, I mean, when Evan Longoria was with the Rays, which I understand the Rays and the Marlins are two completely different organizations, but when it came to the fans showing up to the game, when he got traded to the Giants, one of the first things he kind of harped on being at Tampa Bay was the lack of, it was more enjoyable to be on the road than it was at home because of the way the stadium was filled. Mm-hmm. And do you think that affected any free agent signings either of those teams would have been able to get if there would have been more fans at the stadium?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of undeniable. And you've had, I think the comments weren't quite as blunt, but in similar type of sentiment coming from Derek Dietrich last year when he would join the Reds, and he noted the difference. Even though the Reds that year he was there really struggled, it was a different type of atmosphere around the ballpark just because there are more people there and people that were more engaged in the game. So that stuff does matter. If you're a player and you have a choice with the team that you're going to sign for, you're going to take all that into consideration. And something that we mentioned up top, it's going to be a really important year for them to build up attendance this season and show that fans will respond to a few more wins, but also a few other things they can do on the marketing side and the atmosphere side around the ballpark to make it more attractive for fans to come, because they're at a point where at least the price point to attend games is really reasonable, especially compared to like other major league teams. The changes they've made to concessions to bring in vendors locally that are more popular, ditching Papa John's for Miami's Best Pizza, just little things like that can resonate with people. So it's an important part of the process. I mean, attendance is no longer that big a part of the whole revenue pie. Like it's not some, I guess financially they're more focused on this new television contract that is being negotiated to keep them on Fox Sports Florida for the long term, but at a much higher payout than it used to be. So that's going to be more important than what's actually going on physically in the ballpark. But all these little elements matter, and they've addressed all of them in some way. But this is a big year to prove themselves, at least on the attendance side, that fans to show that the changes that they're making are ones that actually matter in the grand scheme of things.
How many games do you think you attend a season?
Say that again?
How many games do you think you attend a season?
Let's see. I think last year was only about 3 as a fan, because there's that difference between being there as a fan and being there as part of media. And I mean, yeah, some of it just has to do with, I'm probably not the best person to like weigh in on that, because the factors that I have attending games are a little bit different than others in terms of managing things that are actually happening on game day with the rest of my staff, because we have credentialed media in there as part of FishStripes for the vast majority of home games as well. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about that, but all I can say is that I think some of the changes, they have made me come to games a little bit more than in the past, despite the drop off in talent. Some of it just basically being the affordability of both coming to games, the ticket prices, but also the concessions with the 305 menu that they brought in beginning this past season. That if you want to go with really basic food, then you could get it for like almost the same kind of prices that you could get it like locally from small businesses. So that's a really unusual twist, and something that probably caters more to families than it does to me if I'm going individually or with a date. Like, I think ultimately the main focus for any of these teams is trying to appeal to like conventional families that come with 2 parents and multiple kids, because when you have all those guys going together, it's more money in the pockets of the owners, because they get more things between themselves, whether it's food and also merchandise. And so I'm fortunate enough in my position that I can get some of this merch for free from people that are trying to promote it. So I'm not exactly part of their revenue situation in terms of buying it directly from the team. But some of the changes that they've made, I think, do cater towards those typical families that they're trying to get in on a consistent basis.
All right. This question's a little more, I guess it's a little more personal opinion. But do you think the NL East is one of the more competitive divisions, if not the most?
It has to be, yeah. I mean, that's what a lot of people thought coming into last year. At least 4 teams, except for the Marlins, and that's somewhat of the same sentiment coming in nationally again. The 4 main teams, and then there's also the Marlins in there as well. But pretty much every team has done some steps to keep themselves where they were last year, if not make themselves a little bit better. I guess the one team that's susceptible to dropping off a little bit is the Nationals, losing Anthony Rendon, who was probably their most valuable overall player last year, and trying to replace him with Starlin Castro, with Asdrubal Cabrera, and they brought back some of their other key pieces from the World Series team, but it's just so hard to replace a guy like Rendon, given not just the season he had last year, but the past several years that he's had quietly just being like a beast on all sides of the ball. So I think that's going to come back to hurt them a little bit, especially at a time where they don't have a ton of options in their minor league system that are immediately ready to impact things in the majors this year. But I mean, all the other teams, even the Mets, the way that they looked for a lot of the second half of the season, and a lot of the core players, all the teams probably in the division, they've done fewer major league moves than anybody else this offseason, but they really didn't have to do a whole lot. The pieces that they already had in their organization can realistically be expected to take a step forward. And I guess the thought last year was that potentially all the teams, aside from the Marlins, could have a winning record. It usually doesn't play out quite that way. I guess the most disappointing team from the division was the Phillies last year.
Yeah.
And there's only so much wiggle room that they could have to improve because they spent a lot of money heading into last year, and they ended up getting Zach Wheeler from the Mets. And Zach Wheeler is a guy that the common perception is that if you just put him with a smarter team, then he's going to break out and be a superstar. That the Mets may have been holding him back, just depending based on the pure stuff that he has, that he could be a real top of the rotation guy instead of a mid rotation guy. So we'll have to see how that plays out. And they did bring in Joe Girardi to manage them, who someone that I followed kind of closely early in his Yankees career when I was living in New York. So I generally like him as a decision maker over who they had previously in Gabe Kapler. So that's another little thing. I'm not sure how exactly it translates to wins and losses during the season, but it's not going to hurt them whatsoever. It's a tough situation for the Marlins of just being in that division and playing close to half their schedule against those teams. The one team that they were able to do a lot of damage against last year was the Phillies. If you combine like the other three, they lost like 70% of the games that they played against the Braves, the Phillies, the Braves, the Nationals, and the Mets. So if that repeats itself, that's going to be a long way in determining how much progress the Marlins make this year. Is like going from being dominated by those teams to being decent against them. It's going to be a big part of the equation. When you're building a team these days, you probably don't focus too much on matching up with other particular teams. But if the Marlins are really dead set focused on showing major league improvement this year, then I would think that's something they took into consideration when they made some of their offseason acquisitions, is how would these guys particularly function when we're heading up against other teams in our division? Because last year they were really embarrassed, especially by the Braves and the Nationals. They got embarrassed in a lot of those series, and that's probably more so than even the overall record, just how you do in particular games and how close you're able to keep those games. It's something that fans really pay attention to, and it's something that sticks with them, even if they know in the big picture the team's not contending. They do pay close attention to how those really premium games go and whether their team is able to show that they belong in the same league.
Do you think it's going to end up being a lot the same standings-wise, or do you think some things are going to be flipped around?
Well, last year I thought the Nationals would be the best team in the division, and they didn't technically win the division, but they played so well for the second half of the year, and then they obviously got it done at the end, being champions. And so I probably haven't even sat down and thought exactly how the pecking order is going to be, because we still got 2 months to go, and there's still, even though most of the free agents have now dried up, especially with Marcell Ozuna just this week going to the Braves, there's still very potential impactful trade pieces out there on the market, whether it's Chris Bryant or Nolan Arenado or Mookie Betts, or maybe there's a slim chance even Francisco Lindor. And these other teams in the division, they're in win now mode. So these teams are going to be right at the top of the list in terms of trying to trade for other major league proven talent and taking on salaries, because for all of them, probably the Mets and the Phillies and the Nationals, even more so than the Braves are the one that are just set up so well, both in the short term and the long term. For those other ones, they just have so much pressure on them to do well this year. And I mean, even more so than the Nationals, it's the Phillies and the Mets because they don't have that super recent World Series victory to keep their fans satisfied. So those teams are going to be right at the top of the list in terms of trying to acquire other talent and make themselves even better than they are right now. But yeah, I'm pretty optimistic about all four of those other rivals being solid, being 500 or better. And with the Marlins, what I like about this year compared to the other two is there's such a variance in how the season could go for them. To me, they have the floor, and the worst case scenario for this team would look a lot like last year. There is a chance that they again lose 100+ games, but there's also a really encouraging ceiling if everything goes well. Not even everything goes right. I'm talking just like a realistic ceiling where a good portion of these new call-ups and rookies during the season, but they hit the ground running and they have a lot of success. That's something you see across the league where players can acclimate really quickly. It's the Marlins that have been like the exception to that norm, where the last few years their rookies and top prospects have mostly flopped, with Brinson, even with Isan Diaz getting out of the gate really slowly last year when he got his opportunity. But now they have so many of these other intriguing prospects that have different skill sets, and some of them that have been brought along pretty slowly and conservatively, where they're not being rushed in any way. And there's a scenario where a lot of them immediately become valuable players. I really like Nick Neidert as a guy that could make that conversion really quickly. He would have been in the majors already if he didn't hurt his knee last year. And he's someone that is a really dependable strike thrower and who's really consistent at every level that he's played it. And Sixto Sanchez has a higher ceiling than just about anybody that we're going to see for the Marlins coming up this next year. Just a really well-rounded pitcher that combines that fastball velocity with really precise location. And he's someone that even when he's not missing bats, he generates a lot of really weak contact. He works efficiently, and he's made to be a top of the rotation starter as long as he stays healthy. With just some of these guys, not even all of them, but with some of them, if they just show up in the major leagues and begin performing pretty close to their potential, then this is a team that could win 70 games, even 75 games. I think that's probably the realistic best case scenario is like 75. If so many of these guys just make that quick transition, and if the hopes that I have for someone like Pablo Lopez, for Brian Anderson, if they take a further step forward with themselves into being all-star players, then you just have a really deep team. And I don't want it to be like an opt-out, a cop-out, and to try to like defer a prediction. But the big question is going to be what happens at the trade deadline, because even in that realistic best-case scenario, there are going to be sellers at the deadline. They're just considering the division that they're in and the National League overall, where you look across the National League and it's hard to find a team that is tanking this year. That's something we've seen more so in baseball the previous couple of years, but not so much this year. There's no going to be really easy series coming up unless other teams are really devastated by injury or dysfunction. So because of that, the Marlins are going to be selling. And last year, the reason why they finished with so many losses is because they moved Nick Anderson and Sergio Romo, and the rest of their bullpen just crumbled without them in that place. And it's not always that simple. We see it could go either way, really, when you trade away veteran players. Sometimes the younger prospects that you bring up turn out to be improvements, and it's addition by subtraction when you do that. But the Marlins were, last year, they got the worst of it, where it clearly made players uncomfortable in their new roles, and they lost games and underperformed because of it. So there's no real way to anticipate it. If someone like VR is traded at the deadline, if it's Aguilar, if Yimi Garcia, who they signed, ends up emerging as a really quality, high leverage reliever, and they move him, it's just no way to really reliably predict what exactly will happen when a very experienced player moves out of the conversation and you try to fill his spot with a newbie and move him into a new role. And that's why there's so much variance in what this team could be.
Who do you see as the most like leader or the most vocal out of them, out of the players in the majors?
Oh,
Like, who do you think is going to take on that leadership role, whether it be this year or next year, or have already done it?
even last year, Miguel Rojas was someone that showed some of those signs, both on the field. I mean, he was the one, for what it's worth, that he managed the final game of the regular season. Don Mattingly has that tradition where he makes a player the acting manager for the final game of the year, and he chose Rojas last year. Rojas had a good time with that, and he's one that has so much experience with this organization. He's now been here. This will be his sixth year as part of the Marlins organization, and he already has that extension in place. So when you're under contract for a couple of years and you know you're not going to be traded, it really empowers you to mentor other people. It can come in surprising places though, because I mentioned earlier how John Birdie shouted out all those old veterans for being leaders on the team, even though they were on 1-year contracts and even though they weren't actually being able to lead by example on the field that much because they weren't playing as everyday starters. So it doesn't need to be like an everyday shortstop the way that Rojas is. Just one of the reasons why I like Pablo Lopez is because I see some leadership qualities in him with the way that he takes responsibility when he struggles speaking to the media and when he doesn't, how involved he's been with the local community. And that, I mean, he's originally from Venezuela, but I think he spent most of this offseason in Miami taking part in community events that they've had. He's featured in the promo that the team just put up about FanFest, and he had a lot of fun with that. So those things matter, and even though some of it is scripted in terms of what actually we see on social media and elsewhere, he is really embracing the fact that he's a Marlin, so that could show up. I mean, Jesus Aguilar is someone that, at least on the field, plays with him and Jonathan Villar. They express themselves really well on the field and all that stuff, and that can be motivating for other players. But I'd say more so than anybody, it's Rojas, and I don't think I'm alone in this saying that the Marlins should seriously consider literally making him the captain of the team and putting a C on his uniform. That's being something that, of course, Jeter is very familiar with, being a Yankees captain for the majority of his career, and the Marlins have never had that. They've never had that particular tradition of naming a captain and giving them that. It's generally, you rarely see it anywhere in baseball these days, right? I mean, the White Sox have had a few of them, but not currently. The Red Sox in the past, but it's become really unpopular, and maybe it's a little corny, but I mean, Rojas deserves it, and it represents a lot of the good values that they're trying to instill in all the young players.
Do you think Jeter's directing that in any way? Like, pushing him to be more like that? Being that he is the shortstop, he's the everyday shortstop.
Yeah,
there.
Right, yeah. I'm sure that's a factor in some of that as well. I mean, what makes Rojas's career arc kind of unique is that he was never a premium prospect. In that way, he was much different than Jeter coming into pro ball. Teams had no expectations that he was going to be an impactful player in the majors. He struggled to hit at lower levels in the minors, and then he kind of fell on his face when he originally made it to the majors, and he just put in so much work in changing elements of his game and making it the fact that he was missing so many of these standout tools that we consider with most other prospects, and lacking those tangible things he had to make it up for in his intangibles and his fundamentals. He's been able to do that. He's been able to turn himself into like a league average everyday player just by all the work they've put into to change his game. And I mean, that as much as anything, as much as the player that he is now, considering where he came from and how that can connect with a lot of young players. If they do struggle when they come up, he's someone whose voice will carry a lot of weight because he's been through everything. He's been through the fact that he was once really expendable to the Dodgers. I mean, even when the Marlins acquired him, they didn't necessarily see him being an important piece for them. He had to fail a few times with the Marlins in his first couple of years before turning into a guy that you actually wanted to have starting for you on a daily basis. And that just sets a great example for everybody, and it inspires people, and it keeps confidence up. And so even though he would probably rather have gone through a different kind of route, he'd rather have made it to the majors quick and have like physical gifts that he can lean on when he's struggling with the mental approach. The fact that he's been able to overcome that is something that really connects with all the players and all the fans, and that's why they gave him that extension in the first place. At a time when they're really reluctant to spend money on players, they were able to give him a couple of years into his 30s just because of the full package that he brings.
All right, so we're running a little bit on time, but there is something I wanted to do, and I wanted to give you some Marlins trivia. Granted, I pulled it off of a website, so you might have to go back and fact check it. But I got 5 questions here. You mind if I ask you them?
Yeah, I mean, if you didn't pull them off of FishStripes, then I'd probably...
That would be a bad idea, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that'd be a little too easy. But yeah, shoot, go ahead.
All right, so in 2008, the Marlins became the first team in the MLB whose 4 infielders all hit 25 home runs. Who primarily played second base for the Marlins that year?
In 2008, that was Dan Ugla.
That would be correct. Who is the first Florida Marlins manager?
That would... Renee Lockman.
Yep. You're 2 for 2. In 2006, which player led the Marlins in batting average? Led the Marlins in batting average.
Oh, it could be a couple. It's either Hanley Ramirez or Miguel Cabrera. I will go with Hanley.
It was Miguel.
All right. Half a point for that.
You had it narrowed down, so yeah, I'll give you half a point. All right, so how many All-Star players did the Marlins have in 2003?
Ooh, that one's going to be a total guess. 2003. It was one. I'll say 5.
There were 3.
3.
Do you think you can name them?
Well, Pudge is the easy one, right? Pudge Rodriguez.
Pudge is actually not on here.
He's not. Well, I guess that's why the number I had was higher than 3. Well, that was Dontrell Willis's rookie year, and Dontrell and Beckett was there. You're gonna have to give them to me.
It was Mike Lau, Luis Castillo, and Dontrell Willis.
All right.
So you got 1.
Yeah, I was surprised actually by Castillo. I wasn't sure that he was an All-Star that year, but yeah, good one.
All right. In 2009, this one I feel like is the hardest. So in 2009, Hanley Ramirez won the National League batting title. What was his average that season?
Well, that one, I'm pretty sure I know. If that was the year that he had the necklace made out of it, it was 342.
Yep. I'm impressed.
I'm
seriously impressed.
Yeah, well, the image from that is one of the more, I wouldn't say iconic, but I guess definitely since the World Series, that is one of the photos that stuck out to me. He had this really nice piece made that he wore, and I guess he wore it the next year or something like that, but it was beautiful, and it said 342 on it. So I can't tell you, I don't think I could tell you any batting averages in single seasons in Marlins history aside for that one. You chose the one that most clearly sticks in my mind.
Oh, so yeah, we'll give you 4.5 points. No, 3.5 points. Yeah, you missed the 4th one. All right, I'm gonna keep that in mind. I'm gonna write that down.
I'll take that.
I'm gonna start doing this more. So
yeah,
you're in the lead right now out of the 1. But I'd like to thank you for coming on. I'm pretty new to this. There's not, like I told you, this is only my 4th one. I don't have like a giant following on it. You were really easy to contact, and I just wanted to thank you for that.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me on. Go
No
fish.
problem. Yes, sir. You have a good day, man.
Bye, Presley.